Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 and your recorded lecture. Thanks for checking in. In this lecture, we'll be covering basic topics from Dawes on democracy, which were part of this week's readings. I like to start, every lecture, every gathering with an opening quote. This is a quote from one of our generation's most prolific feminist and critical race scholars. Her name is Bell Hooks. If you haven't heard of Bell Hooks so far, she is the author of one of our assigned texts later this semester, All About Love. Her work on democratic education and Black feminist lived experiences has inspired so many educators, leaders, and scholars throughout the world. And her work has also inspired today's social movements, including the activism of Black Lives Matter. So let's get right into it. Let's get into Dawes on democracy being inspired by Bell Hooks and democratic education. Let's go into the reading. Many have wondered if democracy is the ideal philosophy for organizing our communities, societies, and workplaces. So Dahl, in On Democracy, argues that democratic philosophies have evolved over time, indicating that we as human beings have an innate drive and motivation to pursue equality, community, and common goals, and share in our own decision making. Democracy has flourished for centuries, beginning in some parts of ancient Greece and Rome, and Dahl argues that this was due to strong group identities in city-states, little outside interference at times from societies and governments. He also states that during these periods, philosophers wrote extensively about equality as a norm for governing our societies, that we work towards equal voice in decision-making. Historically, we have to remind ourselves that this norm of political equality has been reserved for a small group of elites, mostly men. And slowly, this has expanded to marginalized groups in many societies. In addition to equality, other core aspects of democracy developed in the preceding Middle Ages, which includes checks and balances, which is how we hold leaders accountable, local government and assemblies, and systems that assure consent of the governed, where leadership is driven by elections and representation. Unfortunately, ruling classes and elites have historically restricted free speech to reinforce their power and privilege. These restrictions have historically prevented a mass public, like us, from being educated about democratic issues, which is necessary for informed voting and our own civic participation in any society or community. In addition, persistent social, economic, and racial inequalities have impeded mass participation in democratic societies throughout the world, and this has often led to uprisings among marginalized communities. These uprisings, Dahl argues, have been the norm and not the exception historically. I also recognize that Dahl overlooks a lot of societies that existed outside of the Western world. As we move through this course, we'll be looking at different societies culturally to see how they have also developed democracy. So what is the criteria for democracy? How do we apply democracy to our own contexts, our organizations, our workplaces, our own communities, and even our families? This is one of the major goals of our class. When thinking about a democratic process, we can use these criteria as a way to evaluate what we are doing. First, Dahl discusses the democratic norm of effective participation. This means that all members of a community must have equal and effective opportunities for making their views known on what a policy should be prior to adopting the policy. Second, Dahl discusses voting equality, which means that all members of a community must have an equal and effective opportunity to vote, and all votes must be counted as equal when deciding on a policy. Third, Dahl discusses enlightened understanding, in which all members of a community must have equal and effective opportunities for learning about all the alternative and relevant policies and their consequences prior to making decisions. Fourth, all members of a community must have access to what is included in any agenda setting, including political agendas. Policies and political agendas are always open for change according to what individuals who are part of the community think. Last, all adults in the community must be included in the democratic process. That is, learning about the issues, voting about the issues, decision making, and then subsequent policy changes. All societies, organizations, and communities have varied ways for aligning these criteria. In addition, there's a wide range of mechanisms for achieving these democratic criteria. For instance, in the US, we strive for voting equality, assuring that there are a diversity of ways that adults can vote. However, there are limits to who can vote historically, and even now, including Americans who are incarcerated or who have criminal records, and also restrictions and limits on how one can vote, the various ways in which different states suppress voting access. And right now, and throughout the course, I want you to reflect on these criteria and the extent to which they manifest in your communities, your workplaces, and even your families. So why democracy? Dahl goes into great length about outlining the advantages of a democratic process, society, or community. The process for democracy may seem arduous. It may seem really cumbersome and inefficient and very time consuming. Wouldn't it be easier to focus on efficiency and just delegate power? Dahl, in his outline of the 10 advantages, says no, democracy still has advantages, and they're based on our innate drive for collective decision making. I'm going to highlight a couple of these advantages that may be relevant to you and your understanding of democracy. The first being that this process prevents tyranny and authoritarianism. When we move in the direction of democracy and follow the criteria to the best extent possible, we avoid autocratic decision-making processes, meaning decisions being made by a small elite or by one person in power. Another advantage is self-determination. This occurs when decisions and leadership is informed by citizens and a mass public. There is a desire to create a community and or society that reflects our goals and our own vision, self-determination. And this can be seen a lot in the current movement in Native American sovereignty. Dahl argues that full democracy is unachievable. That is unachievable in our societies, communities, and organizations. So what do we do with that? Even though we will never reach the ideal, we must try to realize it in our actual settings, and we must always work towards it. This requires our belief in the value of democratic leadership. Hence, we should be guided by the following question if we're interested in democratic leadership. How can we make our society, our participation, and our process more democratic? So right now, I invite you to learn more about this particular democratic issue and its relationship to democracy. In the week two page on Canvas, you'll find this YouTube video. It's about 10 minutes on the issue of gerrymandering. And I'd like all of you to reflect on the following question. How does gerrymandering impact our democracy? Now, in terms of your reflection, there's no written assignment that's due, but I just want you to reflect, mentally and intellectually on this topic. And if we have time in class on Thursday, we'll have a dialogue about gerrymandering.